Hello! Welcome to our channel. Today we have an inspiring story full of life lessons to share. If you enjoy meaningful content, leave a like, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments. Your opinion means a lot to us. Let's get started with this touching narrative.
On Christmas Eve, a humble woman helped an elderly man who was on the street shivering in the cold without knowing that he was a millionaire. The streets of Boston glittered under a thin sheen of ice, each step crunching in the frigid December air. Christmas lights flickered merrily in windows, and the smell of roasting chestnuts lingered faintly in the atmosphere. Yet, for Grace Turner, there was no holiday cheer. She tugged her threadbare coat tighter against the biting wind, her scarf pulled high over her chin as she hurried down the uneven sidewalk. Her shift at the diner had ended hours ago, but the thought of returning to her small, unheated apartment didn't exactly lift her spirits. Still, there was her daughter Emma, waiting for her with bright eyes and an unshakable faith that Christmas would bring magic, even if there was barely enough to put dinner on the table. As Grace turned a corner, her steps faltered. Sitting slumped against the side of a building was an elderly man, his face pale and drawn, his hands trembling violently as he clutched a ragged coat around his frail body. His gray hair was disheveled, and his eyes, though half closed, flickered with a sharpness that suggested he hadn't entirely resigned to his plight. Snowflakes collected on his shoulders and on the brim of his worn hat, as if even the elements had decided to turn against him. "Sir," Grace called hesitantly, taking a cautious step closer. She had seen enough desperation in her own life to recognize it in someone else. The man didn't respond at first, his breath coming in shallow, visible puffs. His lips were tinged blue, and a deep shiver racked his body as though his frame could barely sustain the effort to keep warm. Grace crouched beside him, her voice more urgent this time. "Sir, are you okay? Can you hear me?" This time, his eyelids fluttered open, revealing piercing blue eyes that seemed out of place against his current state. His voice, when it came, was a raspy whisper. "Just leave me. I'll be fine." "Fine," Grace scoffed, her breath clouding between them. "You're freezing out here. You're not fine." She glanced around the street. The festive glow of the decorations and the muffled laughter from a nearby party seemed painfully indifferent to the man's plight. She made a quick decision. "Come on," she said, slipping her arm under his and trying to lift him. He flinched at her touch, but she held firm. "I can't leave you out here like this. My apartment's not much, but it's warm." "Why?" he croaked, his gaze searching hers with suspicion. "You don't know me." "No," Grace admitted, her tone soft but resolute. "But I know what it feels like to need help. And right now, you need it more than I do." The man didn't resist further, though Grace could feel the weight of his exhaustion as she helped him to his feet. He leaned heavily on her as they made their way through the icy streets, her own breath hitching with the effort. Every step was a battle against the cold, the wind cutting through her coat like a knife. But she pushed forward, driven by something deeper than logic or practicality, an unshakable belief that no one deserved to be alone on Christmas Eve. Grace's apartment was as modest as she had warned, a one-bedroom unit in a crumbling building on the outskirts of the city. The walls were thin, and the radiator clanked noisily without providing much heat. But to the man now seated in her worn armchair, the space must have felt like a palace. "Here," Grace said, draping her only spare blanket over him. "It's not much, but it should help." She moved to the kitchenette, her hands shaking slightly as she filled a pot with water to heat for tea. Her mind buzzed with questions she didn't dare ask. Who was this man? How had he ended up in such dire straits? And why did he carry himself with an air of dignity that seemed incongruous with his tattered appearance? "What's your name?" she asked over her shoulder, trying to keep her tone light. "Edward," he said after a long pause. His voice was steadier now, though still hoarse. "Edward Hawthorne." "Well, Edward, you're lucky I found you," Grace said, setting a steaming mug of tea on the small table beside him. "Another hour out there, and you might not have made it." Edward took the tea with a trembling hand, his eyes studying her. "You're very kind, Miss Turner." "Grace Turner." She waved a hand dismissively. "And it's not kindness. It's just what anyone would do." "I wouldn't be so sure of that," Edward murmured, his gaze dropping to the tea as though it held some profound truth. Grace hesitated, unsure how to respond. The weight of his words hung in the air, heavier than she expected. She turned her attention to the stove, where a pot of soup simmered. It was a simple vegetable broth, stretched thin to last a few days, but tonight it would have to serve two. "Do you live around here?" she ventured, handing him a bowl of soup. "No," Edward said, shaking his head. "Not anymore." His answer was evasive, but Grace didn't press. Instead, she sat across from him, her own bowl cradled in her hands. The small kitchen table between them felt like an island in a sea of unspoken truths. As they ate, Grace talked, partly to fill the silence and partly because she felt a strange urge to share her story with this man who seemed to carry the weight of the world on his hunched shoulders. She spoke of Emma, her precocious 8-year-old daughter who was likely asleep in their shared bedroom, clutching the threadbare teddy bear that had been her only Christmas gift the year before. She talked about working double shifts at the diner, about the bills that never seemed to stop piling up, and about the small, flickering hope she clung to that someday things would get better. Edward listened intently, his bowl of soup forgotten in his lap. When she paused, he asked, "And what about your Christmas? Do you have anything planned?" Grace laughed, the sound tinged with both humor and bitterness. "Christmas? That's for people with money to spare. For Emma, I'll do what I can. Maybe bake some cookies, read her a story. But there's no tree, no gifts, no big dinner." Edward's expression softened, a shadow of something like regret passing over his features. "She's lucky to have you," he said quietly. "Not every child gets that." The words struck Grace in a way she hadn't expected, and she found herself blinking back tears. "I'm just doing my best," she murmured. "That's all anyone can do." By the time the clock struck midnight, Edward's color had returned, and he no longer shivered under the blanket. Grace insisted he take the armchair for the night, refusing to let him leave in the freezing cold. But when she awoke the next morning, he was gone. On the table, where he had sat the night before, lay a folded note and a small object wrapped in a piece of cloth. The note read, Grace. "Thank you for your kindness. It is a rare gift in this world, and one I will not forget. Please accept this as a token of my gratitude. You deserve far more than you've been given, and I hope this brings you some measure of the joy you've brought me." With trembling hands, Grace unwrapped the cloth to reveal a gleaming gold pocket watch. The craftsmanship was exquisite, its surface etched with delicate filigree, and when she opened it, the face shone with tiny diamonds marking the hours. Her breath caught in her throat. What kind of man gives away something so valuable? And why had he chosen her? Standing in the quiet of her modest kitchen, Grace couldn't shake the feeling that her life had just changed in ways she couldn't yet comprehend. Grace stood in the center of her tiny kitchen, the golden pocket watch gleaming in her palm like a treasure from another world. She turned it over carefully, running her fingers along its intricate filigree. It was beautiful, far too beautiful for someone like her to possess. The thought gnawed at her. A pocket watch like this didn't belong to an ordinary man. Who exactly was Edward Hawthorne, and why had he been out in the cold, trembling and destitute, only to leave behind something so precious? She read the note again, her lips forming the words silently. "You deserve far more than you've been given." The sentiment warmed her heart, but it also unsettled her. How could he know what she deserved? They had shared just a few hours together. Yet his words lingered, filling the tiny apartment with an air of mystery she couldn't shake. "Mom!" A sleepy voice called from the bedroom doorway. Grace looked up to see Emma rubbing her eyes, her brown hair sticking up in messy tufts. The sight of her daughter made Grace smile despite her racing thoughts. She slipped the watch and note into her pocket and opened her arms as Emma padded across the cold floor to her. "Good morning, sweetheart," Grace said, kissing the top of her daughter's head. "Is it Christmas now?" Emma asked, her eyes lighting up with excitement. "It is," Grace replied, her voice soft. "Merry Christmas. Did Santa come?" Emma's hopeful tone tugged at Grace's heart. She bit her lip, wishing she could conjure a miracle out of thin air. "Not exactly," Grace said, guiding Emma to the kitchen table. "But I have a surprise. Let's make some pancakes and see what Christmas magic we can find today, okay?" Emma's face brightened at the mention of pancakes, and Grace busied herself with the small act of making batter, grateful for the distraction. As she worked, the weight of the pocket watch in her coat pocket seemed to grow heavier, demanding her attention. After breakfast, Grace set Emma up with crayons and paper, encouraging her to draw pictures of all the things she imagined Santa might bring next year. When her daughter was sufficiently occupied, Grace pulled out the watch again, turning it over in her hands. She had to know more about Edward Hawthorne. He wasn't just some unlucky soul down on his luck. This watch proved that much. It had to be worth thousands of dollars, and something about him, felt far more complicated than she had realized. With Emma humming happily at the table, Grace retrieved her phone and searched for Edward Hawthorne. To her astonishment, one of the first results was a news article with his photo. She clicked it quickly, her heart pounding. The headline read, "Missing Boston Millionaire. Edward Hawthorne disappears on Christmas Eve." Grace's breath caught in her throat. The article described him as the head of Hawthorne Enterprises, a massive real estate empire that had dominated Boston's skyline for decades. It went on to explain that Edward had been estranged from his children, Oliver and Charlotte Hawthorne, for years, and that his disappearance had sparked a frantic search by his family. The last known sighting of him had been leaving his office on the afternoon of December 24th. She leaned back in her chair, her mind reeling. A millionaire. She had spent Christmas Eve sharing soup and blankets with a man worth more money than she could comprehend. But why had he been on the streets? And why had he chosen her apartment to retreat to instead of one of his many luxurious properties? Grace glanced at the watch again, her fingers tracing its smooth edges. It didn't make sense. If Edward Hawthorne was so wealthy, why had he looked so broken, so lost? The sound of Emma's giggles brought Grace back to the moment. She folded the article away in her mind and joined her daughter at the table, deciding to focus on the here and now. But as the day wore on, her thoughts kept circling back to Edward. She felt a strange sense of responsibility for him, as though his brief stay in her apartment had connected them in some unspoken way. By late afternoon, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the city lights began to twinkle, Grace made a decision. She had to return the watch. It wasn't hers to keep, and if the article was correct, Edward's family must be frantic to find him. Perhaps returning it would be the key to helping him reconnect with his life, and maybe to understanding why he had been in such a desperate state. With Emma bundled up in her warmest clothes, Grace hailed a cab and gave the driver the address for Hawthorne Enterprises. She clutched the watch in her pocket as they drove through the snowy streets, her nerves tightening with each passing block. When they arrived, she stared up at the sleek glass tower, its name emblazoned in bold letters near the entrance. It was intimidating, a far cry from the modest diner where she spent her days scraping by. She felt a pang of doubt. What if they didn't believe her? What if they accused her of stealing the watch? But Grace shook off her hesitation. She wasn't here to gain anything, only to do the right thing. Taking Emma's hand, she pushed open the heavy doors and stepped into the grand lobby. A receptionist greeted them with a polite but disinterested smile. "May I help you?" I need to speak to someone about Edward Hawthorne," Grace said, her voice steady despite her nerves. The receptionist's expression sharpened. "Do you have information about Mr. Hawthorne's whereabouts?" Maybe. I just need to speak to someone in his family," Grace replied. The receptionist picked up the phone and made a quick call. Moments later, a tall man in an impeccable suit appeared. His sharp features and cold blue eyes reminded Grace immediately of Edward, though his expression was far less welcoming. "I'm Oliver Hawthorne," he said curtly. "You said you have information about my father?" Grace nodded, her hand tightening around Emma's. "I met him last night. He stayed at my apartment. He left this behind." She pulled the watch from her pocket and held it out to him. Oliver's eyes widened as he recognized the piece, but his expression quickly turned suspicious. "And how exactly did you end up with this?" Grace took a deep breath and explained everything. How she had found Edward in the cold, how she had brought him home and cared for him, and how he had left before dawn, leaving only the watch and a note behind. When she finished, Oliver studied her for a long moment, his gaze hard and calculating. "You expect me to believe that my father, a man with everything at his disposal, chose to spend Christmas Eve in a stranger's apartment?" "I'm not lying," Grace said firmly. "And I don't know why he chose me, but he did. I just wanted to return the watch and make sure he's okay." Oliver's expression softened slightly, though his skepticism didn't fade entirely. "If what you're saying is true, then you're the last person to see him. That makes you very important." Grace blinked, taken aback. "I'm just trying to help." Oliver nodded slowly. "Then perhaps you can." As he spoke, Grace felt the weight of the watch in her hand again. The air in the room seemed to thicken, and she couldn't shake the feeling that she had just stepped into something much bigger than she had anticipated. Grace's stomach churned as Oliver's icy gaze bore into her. She tightened her grip on Emma's hand, taking comfort in her daughter's innocent presence amidst the growing tension. She had expected gratitude, perhaps even relief, from Edward's family, but what she faced was suspicion cloaked in a thin veil of politeness. Oliver took the pocket watch from her hand, his fingers brushing the intricate surface as if it might confirm her story. His lips pressed into a thin line. "This belonged to my father, no doubt about it. But you still haven't explained why he left it with you." "I told you," Grace said, her voice steady despite the apprehension bubbling beneath the surface. "He showed up in front of my building. He was freezing. I couldn't just leave him out there." "And he stayed in your apartment?" "The great Edward Hawthorne." Oliver's tone was dripping with incredulity. "Yes," Grace said firmly. "And if he's half the man I think he is, he didn't tell you much about it because he didn't want to." Emma tugged at her mother's sleeve, her small voice breaking the tension. "Mommy, are we in trouble?" Grace knelt, brushing a strand of hair from Emma's face. "No, sweetheart," she said softly, though the nervous flutter in her chest told a different story. "We're just trying to help." Oliver sighed sharply, drawing their attention back to him. "Look," he said, pinching the bridge of his nose, "my father's been unwell lately. He's unpredictable, wandering off like this. But I need to know exactly what happened. If you're lying—" "I'm not lying," Grace interrupted, her patience wearing thin. She straightened to her full height, though it was nothing compared to Oliver's imposing figure. "I found him outside. I helped him. That's all." For a moment, Oliver said nothing, studying her as if weighing whether her story was worth his time. Then he turned sharply to the receptionist. "Get Charlotte." The receptionist nodded and disappeared into the labyrinth of hallways behind the desk. Grace glanced down at Emma, who looked up at her with wide, questioning eyes. "It's okay," she murmured, squeezing her daughter's hand. But the truth was, Grace wasn't sure if it was okay at all. After a few tense minutes, the sound of heels clicking against the marble floor echoed through the lobby. A striking woman with auburn hair swept into the room, her emerald green coat flaring elegantly behind her. Her expression was a mix of irritation and curiosity as she approached. "This is who claimed to see father." Charlotte's tone was sharp as a blade, her eyes raking over Grace and Emma with barely concealed disdain. "Is this some kind of joke?" "No joke," Oliver replied, handing her the pocket watch. "She says father left this with her." Charlotte's perfectly arched brows lifted in surprise as she turned the watch over in her hands. "This really is his?" But why? She stopped herself, her gaze snapping back to Grace. Where is he? I don't know, Grace admitted. He left before I woke up this morning. Charlotte narrowed her eyes. How convenient. Anger flared in Grace's chest. I don't know what kind of people you think I am, but I didn't ask for any of this. I only came here because I thought you'd want to know he's okay. You'll have to forgive our skepticism, Charlotte said coolly. It's not every day a stranger claims to have harbored one of the most influential men in the city. Grace opened her mouth to respond, but Oliver cut in. Enough. If she's telling the truth, then she might be the only one who can help us find him. And if she's lying? Charlotte countered. Then we'll deal with it, Oliver said, his tone leaving no room for argument. Charlotte's jaw tightened, but she nodded. Oliver turned back to Grace, his demeanor slightly softer. You said he left this morning. Did he say anything before he left? Anything at all about where he was going? No, Grace replied. But he did leave a note. It's at my apartment. I can bring it to you. Oliver nodded. We'll come with you. The words sent a shiver down Grace's spine. She hadn't expected them to take such a personal interest, and the thought of the Hawthornes stepping into her modest home felt surreal. Still, she had no choice. She had come this far, and if finding Edward meant enduring their scrutiny, so be it. Fine, she said. But you'll have to follow me. The drive back to Grace's apartment was silent and tense. Charlotte and Oliver followed in a sleek black sedan, a stark contrast to the old cab Grace had flagged down. Emma, oblivious to the weight of the moment, chattered about the snowflakes falling outside the window. Grace tried to focus on her daughter's innocent enthusiasm, but her thoughts kept circling back to Edward. Where had he gone? Why hadn't he told her more about his situation? When they arrived, Grace led them up the narrow staircase to her apartment. She felt acutely aware of every crack in the walls, every scuff on the floor as she unlocked the door. Inside, the space seemed even smaller with the Hawthornes standing in it, their polished appearances starkly out of place among the mismatched furniture and peeling wallpaper. Grace crossed to the kitchen table, where she had left Edward's note. She handed it to Oliver without a word. He unfolded it carefully, his expression unreadable as he read the simple message. Thank you for your kindness, he read aloud. It is a rare gift in this world. His gaze flicked up to Grace, and for the first time, there was a hint of something other than suspicion in his eyes. This is his handwriting. Charlotte, who had been inspecting the apartment with thinly veiled distaste, looked over his shoulder. So he's grateful. That doesn't tell us where he is. No, but it tells us why he stayed, Oliver said quietly. He glanced around the room, taking in the worn furniture, the chipped dishes drying on the counter. He wanted to remember what it feels like to be treated like a human being. The words hung in the air, their weight sinking into the room. Grace felt a flush rise in her cheeks. She hadn't done anything extraordinary, at least, not in her mind. But hearing Oliver say it aloud made her realize how rare such a gesture must have been in Edward's world. Charlotte broke the silence with a sharp sigh. This doesn't get us any closer to finding him. If he left this morning, he could be anywhere by now. We'll find him, Oliver said, his tone firm. He turned to Grace. Thank you for what you did. I'm sorry if we came across as ungrateful. Grace nodded, unsure what to say. Before she could respond, Oliver handed her a card. If you hear anything at all, call me. Day or night. Grace took the card, feeling a strange sense of finality as the siblings turned to leave. But as they stepped into the hallway, Oliver paused. Grace, he said, glancing back. My father doesn't trust easily. The fact that he stayed here says more than you know. With that, they were gone, leaving Grace to stand in the quiet of her apartment, the card in her hand and 1,000 unanswered questions swirling in her mind. That night, Grace couldn't sleep. She lay on her worn-out mattress, staring at the cracked ceiling as the faint hum of the radiator filled the silence. Emma slept soundly beside her, clutching her teddy bear, her face serene in the soft glow of the streetlight seeping through the curtains. But Grace's mind churned with thoughts of Edward Hawthorne. She replayed every moment they had shared, every word he had spoken. Something about him had felt genuine, his quiet gratitude, his lingering sadness. He hadn't carried himself like a man used to wielding power or wealth. He had seemed lost. Why had he wandered into the cold, leaving behind a world of privilege? And where was he now? Grace sighed, turning onto her side. A part of her wanted to push the entire situation out of her mind, to focus on her own struggles and let the Hawthorne family deal with their problems. But another part, the part of her that had stopped to help a freezing stranger, couldn't let it go. Edward had trusted her, if only briefly. That trust felt like a responsibility she couldn't ignore. The next morning, she woke early, her determination solidified. She would try to find him. She wasn't sure how, but she owed it to Edward, to herself, to at least try. The first place Grace thought to check was the area where she had found him. After dropping Emma off with her neighbor, an older woman named Mrs. Callahan who often watched her daughter in exchange for baked goods, Grace bundled up and headed out into the frosty morning. The streets were quieter than usual, the remnants of Christmas lingering in the form of discarded wrapping paper fluttering in the gutters and wreaths still hanging in shop windows. Grace retraced her steps, her boots crunching on the icy pavement as she scanned every alley and doorway. When she reached the spot where she had first seen Edward, she stopped. The patch of sidewalk was empty, save for a few cigarette butts and a discarded soda can. She stood there for a moment, the memory of his trembling form vivid in her mind. "Excuse me, miss," a gravelly voice interrupted her thoughts. Grace turned to see an older man in a heavy coat, his face weathered from years on the streets. He leaned on a cane, his sharp eyes studying her. "You looking for someone?" he asked, nodding toward the spot she had been staring at. "Yes," Grace said, taking a step closer. An older man. White hair, a bit frail. "His name's Edward. I found him here on Christmas Eve, but he's gone now." The man squinted, his lips pulling into a thoughtful frown. "You mean the guy in the fancy coat?" "Yeah, I saw him." Grace's heart leaped. "You did? When?" "Couple days ago," the man replied. "He was sitting right there like you said. Didn't look like he belonged out here though. Too clean, too polite. He gave me a couple bucks and asked where he could find the nearest church." "A church?" Grace repeated, her mind racing. "Yeah. Told him about St. Mary's down on 5th. Nice place. They do meals for folks like us." "Thank you," Grace said, already stepping back. "Thank you so much." The man tipped his hat to her as she hurried away, her breath visible in the cold air. St. Mary's was a modest brick building with a faded sign and a row of wooden benches lining its entrance. A small group of people milled about, their faces weary but hopeful. The smell of soup wafted from the basement kitchen, where volunteers worked tirelessly to serve those in need. Grace approached a woman handing out cups of coffee. She was middle-aged, with kind eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor. "Excuse me," Grace said. "I'm looking for someone. His name is Edward Hawthorne. He might have come here a couple of days ago." The woman paused, her brow furrowing in thought. "Hawthorne? Doesn't ring a bell. But there was an older gentleman here recently. White hair, looked like he'd seen better days. He kept to himself mostly." "That's him," Grace said quickly. "Do you know where he went?" The woman shook her head. "I'm sorry, I don't. He didn't stay long. Just had some soup and left. But Father Donovan might know more. He spoke with him while he was here." "Is he around?" Grace asked. "In the sanctuary," the woman replied, nodding toward the main chapel. Grace thanked her and headed inside. The sanctuary was quiet, the only sound the faint rustle of someone turning pages near the altar. A tall man in a simple black cassock stood there, his silver-framed glasses perched on the edge of his nose as he read from a thick, leather-bound Bible. "Father Donovan?" Grace called softly. The man looked up, his face lighting with a gentle smile. "Yes. How can I help you?" "My name is Grace Turner," she said, stepping closer. I'm looking for someone who might have come here recently. Edward Hawthorne. Father Donovan's expression shifted, a flicker of recognition passing over his features. Yes, I spoke with Mr. Hawthorne. He came by on Christmas Eve. Relief flooded Grace's chest. Do you know where he went? The priest closed his Bible, his gaze thoughtful. We talked for a while. He seemed conflicted, lost. He mentioned wanting to find peace, to make amends for something. I suggested he visit a retreat center outside the city, St. Francis Haven. It's a quiet place, good for reflection. Grace nodded, filing the name away. Did he say why he wanted to go there? Father Donovan hesitated. He spoke about his family, about regrets. I got the sense that he'd been carrying a heavy burden for a long time. Grace's throat tightened. Thank you, Father. I think I know where to find him now. The priest placed a hand on her shoulder as she turned to leave. Miss Turner, he said, his voice gentle. Whatever he's seeking, I believe your kindness made an impression on him. Sometimes, even the smallest gestures can change a life. Grace nodded, her heart swelling with both hope and uncertainty. She left the church determined to find Edward and uncover the truth behind his disappearance. The retreat center was a 2-hour bus ride away, nestled in the snowy hills outside Boston. Grace felt the weight of the journey as she stared out the window, Emma's teddy bear tucked under her arm as a source of quiet comfort. The farther they went, the more her surroundings shifted from city streets to sprawling fields blanketed in white. When the bus finally pulled to a stop near the entrance of St. Francis Haven, Grace stepped off and took a deep breath of the crisp, pine-scented air. The retreat center was simple and serene, its stone buildings surrounded by tall evergreens. Grace approached the main office, her boots crunching in the snow. A friendly woman greeted her, her smile warm against the chill of the day. May I help you? I'm looking for someone, Grace said. Edward Hawthorne. He might have come here recently. The woman's smile faded slightly. Mr. Hawthorne? Yes, he arrived a few days ago. But I'm afraid he asked not to be disturbed. Please, Grace said, her voice breaking with urgency. I just need to talk to him. It's important. The woman hesitated, then nodded. He's in the chapel. It's just down the path. Grace thanked her and followed the snowy trail, her heart pounding with anticipation. As she reached the small, rustic chapel, she paused, gathering her courage. Inside, Edward sat alone in the front pew, his back to her. He was hunched forward, his hands clasped tightly, as if deep in prayer. Edward, Grace said softly, her voice trembling. He turned slowly, his eyes widening in surprise. For a moment, neither of them spoke, the weight of unspoken truths hanging heavy between them. You found me, Edward said finally, his voice a mixture of wonder and resignation. Yes, Grace replied, stepping closer. And now I need to know, what are you running from? Edward's shoulders sagged as he exhaled deeply, his breath faintly visible in the cold air of the chapel. He gestured to the pew beside him, his face a mixture of weariness and reluctance. Grace hesitated for only a moment before sitting down, her gaze fixed on him. The man who had appeared so lost and fragile on Christmas Eve now seemed even more burdened, as though the quiet peace of the retreat center had only given him more time to wrestle with his demons. I wasn't running, Edward finally said, his voice low and deliberate. At least, not in the way you think. I was searching. For what? Grace asked softly. Edward didn't answer immediately. He stared ahead, his eyes tracing the delicate stained glass window at the front of the chapel. The colors glowed faintly in the winter light, casting soft patterns on the worn wooden floor. Forgiveness, he said at last. The word hung in the air, heavy and solemn. Grace frowned. Forgiveness for what? From who? Edward turned his head slightly, his blue eyes meeting hers. They were sharp yet haunted, as if he carried an ocean of unspoken truths behind them. Myself. My family. And perhaps, from the life I built. Grace waited, sensing he needed space to let the words come. For most of my life, Edward began, his tone growing steadier, I believed success meant winning. It meant building something so grand, so powerful, that no one could ignore it. I worked day and night, sacrificing everything else for that dream. And I achieved it. Hawthorne Enterprises became the crown jewel of Boston's skyline, and with it, I amassed more money than I could ever spend. He paused, his jaw tightening. But the cost was greater than I imagined. My wife, Eleanor, warned me. She said I was neglecting what mattered most. Her, our children, our family. I brushed her off, convinced I could make up for it later. But later never came. She died 10 years ago, and I never made things right with her. Not once. Grace's chest tightened. She could see the weight of his regret etched into every line of his face. My children, Oliver and Charlotte, grew up with wealth but without a father, Edward continued, his voice tinged with bitterness. I gave them everything material they could ever want but left them starved for the one thing that mattered most. Love. And now, they've become reflections of me. Hardened, driven, consumed by ambition. I see in them the mistakes I made, and it terrifies me. You think it's too late to fix it? Grace asked gently. Edward let out a hollow laugh. When I tried to step back, to reconnect, they saw it as weakness. They treated me like a relic, an obstacle to their own goals. It was easier for them to dismiss me than to forgive me. The words hung between them, thick with the weight of his confession. Grace's mind spun as she tried to piece together the man sitting beside her with the towering figure she had read about in the news. Why were you out in the cold that night? She asked after a moment. Edward's gaze fell to his hands, clasped tightly in his lap. Because I needed to feel something real again. 4 years, I've been surrounded by wealth, luxury, people who tell me what I want to hear. But I felt hollow, like everything I'd built was a facade. That night, I wanted to strip it all away, to remind myself what it meant to be human. He turned to her, his expression softening. And then I met you. You didn't know who I was, and yet you showed me kindness. You gave me a warmth I hadn't felt in years. Not just the soup or the blanket, but the way you treated me, like a person worth caring about. Grace's cheeks flushed, and she looked down, unsure how to respond. That's why I left the watch, Edward said. It wasn't just a token of gratitude. It was a piece of me I felt you deserved more than I did. Grace swallowed hard. She had thought returning the watch would bring closure, but instead, it had opened the door to a deeper, more complicated truth. Edward, she said, her voice steady despite the whirlwind of emotions inside her. You said your children dismissed you. But have you tried to show them the side of you I've seen? The man who's searching, who wants to make things right. He shook his head, a sad smile tugging at the corners of his lips. They wouldn't believe it. To them, I'm the man who prioritized skyscrapers over bedtime stories. They've spent their lives learning to fight for everything, to trust no one. Vulnerability isn't a language they understand. Grace leaned forward, her elbows resting on her knees. Maybe it's not about what they understand. Maybe it's about what you're willing to do. You've spent years building an empire. What if you spent the rest of your time building bridges instead? Edward's eyes softened, and for the first time, a glimmer of hope flickered within them. Do you really believe that's possible? I do, Grace said firmly. But you have to want it. And you have to be willing to fight for it. Not with deals or contracts, but with love and patience. Edward didn't respond immediately. He stared at the floor, his fingers gripping the edge of the pew as though grounding himself. Finally he nodded, a faint smile touching his lips. Maybe you're right, he said. Maybe it's time I stopped running and started rebuilding. Grace exhaled, relief washing over her. She had feared he would dismiss her words, retreating further into his regret. But now, there was a chance, a fragile, flickering chance, that he might find redemption. As they sat in silence, the quiet hum of the chapel wrapping around them like a cocoon, Edward reached into his pocket and pulled out a small envelope. He handed it to Grace, his expression solemn. "What's this?" she asked. "A thank you," Edward said, "for reminding me what it means to care." Grace hesitated, then opened the envelope. Inside was a check, more zeros than she had ever seen in her life. "I can't accept this," she said quickly, pushing it back toward him. "You can," Edward said firmly. "And you will. You didn't ask for anything, Grace, but you gave me more than you realize. Let this be my way of giving back, to you and to Emma. Start something new. Build something better. You deserve it." Tears pricked at Grace's eyes as she stared at the check. She thought of Emma, of their tiny apartment, of all the dreams she had been forced to set aside. Edward's gift wasn't just money. It was a chance to rewrite her life. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice breaking. Edward nodded, his own eyes misty. "No, Grace. Thank you." In that moment, two lives, one burdened by guilt, the other by struggle, found a glimmer of hope. The path ahead wouldn't be easy for either of them, but together, they had taken the first step towards something better. The days that followed felt like the calm after a storm. Edward left the retreat center with a newfound resolve, his presence no longer shrouded in regret but illuminated by purpose. Grace returned home, clutching the envelope he had given her, her heart a mixture of gratitude and apprehension. She wasn't sure what the future would hold, but for the first time in years, she felt the weight of possibility. With the money Edward had provided, she was able to move Emma into a safer neighborhood, one with better schools and the promise of opportunity. They found a modest house with a small yard where Emma could play. For the first time, Grace allowed herself to dream without fear of how she would make ends meet. Edward, too, began his journey of change. He returned to the Hawthorne family estate, his arrival met with shock and disbelief by Oliver and Charlotte. Their father, who had once seemed so distant and unreachable, now stood before them as a man who carried humility in his eyes and determination in his heart. "I've made mistakes," Edward said simply, standing in the grand sitting room where countless arguments had unfolded over the years. "But I want to do better. Not for my legacy, not for the business, but for you. For us." Oliver and Charlotte exchanged skeptical glances, their defenses rising instinctively. But Edward didn't falter. Over the following weeks, he made good on his promise, stepping away from Hawthorne Enterprises to focus on mending the broken threads of their family. It wasn't easy. Years of bitterness and miscommunication couldn't be undone overnight, but Edward's perseverance slowly began to chip away at the walls his children had built. Months later, on a sunny spring afternoon, Grace found herself standing in the middle of her new cafe, Emma's Hearth. The name had been Emma's idea, a tribute to the warmth and love they had always tried to hold on to, no matter how difficult life had been. The cafe wasn't just a business, it was a community space, where anyone could come in for a cup of coffee, a warm meal, or just a kind word. Grace had made it her mission to offer pay-what-you-can meals and to hire people who had struggled to find work. She wanted the cafe to be a second chance for others, just as Edward's generosity had given her a second chance. The grand opening was bustling with activity, neighbors and friends filling the space with laughter and chatter. Emma darted around the room, handing out cookies she had helped bake that morning. Grace watched her with a mixture of pride and disbelief. "Not bad for a girl who couldn't afford a Christmas tree," came a familiar voice. Grace turned to see Edward standing in the doorway, his face softened by a warm smile. He looked healthier, more at ease than she had ever seen him. "Edward," she said, her heart lifting at the sight of him. "You came." "Of course," he said, stepping inside. "I wouldn't miss this for the world." Grace led him to a table near the window, where he marveled at the space she had created. "This is incredible, Grace. Truly. You've built something beautiful here. I couldn't have done it without you," she said. Edward shook his head. "You had it in you all along. I just gave you the means to let it flourish." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, watching the cafe buzz with life. Then Edward reached into his pocket and pulled out something small and familiar. The pocket watch. "I thought you might like this back," he said, setting it on the table between them. Grace picked it up, running her fingers over the delicate filigree. "You're sure?" Edward nodded. "It belongs here. This place, what you've created, It's the true heart of what I've been searching for. A reminder of what matters. Grace's eyes misted, and she slipped the watch into her apron pocket, her gratitude too profound for words. As the day went on, Edward mingled with the guests, offering kind words and listening to their stories. He was no longer the distant tycoon or the lost man Grace had found on a cold Christmas Eve. He was simply Edward, a man who had found his way back to himself. Years later, Grace would often think back to that snowy night when she had stumbled across Edward on the streets of Boston. She would tell Emma how a single act of kindness had changed the course of their lives, creating ripples that reached farther than they could have ever imagined. Edward became a frequent visitor to the cafe, offering advice, lending support, and quietly funding Grace's efforts to expand her mission. He continued to repair his relationship with Oliver and Charlotte, and though the process was slow, it was steady. They, too, began to see the man Edward was becoming, rather than the man he had been. As for Grace, she found fulfillment not in the money or the success of her cafe, but in the connections it fostered, the laughter, the hope, the stories that unfolded within its walls. Because sometimes, the greatest gifts come not from what we take, but from what we give. Thank you for joining Grace and Edward on this journey of redemption, kindness, and second chances. This story reminds us that no matter how far we may have strayed, it's never too late to reconnect with what truly matters. If you've been inspired by their journey, take a moment to reflect on the power of small acts of kindness. Who knows? You might just change someone's life, or your own. Let's carry this spirit forward. Share this story with someone who needs hope, and remember, even in the coldest winters, the warmth of compassion can light the way.